Thank you for having me this afternoon at the William Trent House. My name's Andy Urban. I'm an associate professor of American Studies and History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. The title of my talk, and I say talk, it's going to be a bit more informal than that. I'm going to certainly invite people who are here to ask me questions and to engage in a process I'm going to be talking about. That process being how to think through questions related to interpreting the lives of paid, wage-working, domestic laborers who worked in this house during different periods, and how to potentially foreground their stories and histories. And again, the title of my talk, Private Spaces, Public History, Interpreting Labor and Migration at Historic Homes and Sites in New Jersey. And as the title suggests, I'm going to think more generally as well about other efforts that I'm involved in to interpret residencies, historic sites, and dwellings that aren't typical of what tends to get preserved for analysis, education, and so forth. Before I get into a lot of that, I'm going to start with an anecdote. We're going to go back in my own personal life to prior to when I began graduate school. I worked at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City, and I guess I technically worked there from 2001 to 2005. Whoops. And I'm seeing some nods among the folks who are here. For those of you who don't know about the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, it's a museum and historic site on the Lower East Side of New York City in Manhattan, where they've restored and are now interpreting through tours a historic tenement that was built in 1863, closed as a residency in 1935, and during that lifespan as a tenement building, an apartment building, housed roughly 7,000 people. And when the Tenement Museum opened in the 1990s, it was considered a very novel idea at the time, in the sense that it generated a lot of interest among academics, among public historians, those in the worlds of historic preservation, because really, by and large, up to that point, any historic structure that we might identify as preserved, as open to the public for programming and for tours, I'm sure there were probably a handful of exceptions, and we could probably find the oddball example that pushes back against the point I'm making. But by and large, right, these buildings were those that belonged to America's white elite, and more typically those who had gained some sort of fame or prominence through their business, political, and other activities, right? And as we'll talk about, certainly these homes included working people, quite literally the domestic laborers, the cooks, the gardeners, and so forth, who allowed these homes to actually function and operate. But the tours and interpretation at those sites certainly weren't focused on those people. And the building itself, that, you know, were the mansions, the elite homes, were a different form of architecture altogether, right? They tended to be built, for instance, by known architects who worked for firms, did specific commissions, right? This is one way in which the elite projected their social class and status by having the ability to pay someone to do that. Whereas if you looked at, right, the repetitive and repeating tenements in terms of their design of a city like New York or Newark or Trenton, right? We don't know who built individual row houses or tenements because they were done by a design, and they were in a sense mass produced, right? Because the people who lived there were also in a sense the masses, right? These were working class immigrants, migrants, Americans who were looking for affordable housing in cities in proximity to the jobs that they worked, often at factories and manufacturing concerns and so forth, right? And again, maybe we take it for granted today at least, right, that it would be helpful and make sense, right, to preserve and interpret dwellings, buildings, right, that told the lives and story of everyday Americans. Really, until the 1990s, this wasn't happening in the fields themselves. And because I gave tours at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, I always like to share this one anecdote I have, because I think it's revealing and actually brings up kind of complicated questions. You know, I gave these tours, you did like 4 or 5 a day. You do them all the time, right? You get into your routine. And you know, the typical reaction, and probably from people certainly my age and maybe even slightly older than me, was that, oh, these are really interesting spaces, right? And you see the picture here, where we get a sense of just how crowded these dwellings were, right? How you would have had to, you know, negotiate this delicate dance, you know, if 8 or 9 people were crammed into 700 square feet and so forth. And these were the kind of facts that we would dazzle visitors with and, you know, expect responses. But, you know, this one time this old guy kind of just said to the group, you know, this is neat, but this isn't like kind of interesting to me in the sense of distance, something I need to kind of learn about and understand, right? Like, this is what I grew up in, right? He grew up on the Lower East Side in the, you know, early to mid 20th century, and again, right, this was the kind of ubiquitous space of his childhood. And so even he had a bit of challenge or difficulty, right? In part because we have such closeness and intimacy with the everyday that in some ways we've created kind of mechanisms where we almost think that it's not worthy of preservation, analysis, and interpretation in the same way. And I'll show you here, right, this is the Tenement Museum's About Us description. Again, talking about why you need to preserve these spaces and to, you know, use them in such a manner so that they create different types of engagement with historic audiences in the present, right? And at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, the idea, at least in theory, was also that if kids were coming from immigrant working class neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn, right, to them as well, this wouldn't seem necessarily as distant or in somehow the foreign past, right? It would be relevant and maybe inspiring that, again, right, their own lives would be worthy of study because what they're doing matters as well and tells us lots of important things about our society and the world we live in. And so I play with a lot of these ideas in my class a lot. I'm a big fan of the land artist Robert Smithson. Some of you know his work. He's been most famous for Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake out in Utah, this wonderful work of land art. But he's actually from Passaic, New Jersey originally, and got his start as an artist in New Jersey. And he played with this idea as well, right? He called them non-sites, just typical suburban, sometimes industrial landscapes of northern New Jersey, filled of maybe construction materials, in this case rocks, right, that we can see as part of a, you know, these are not natural rock insofar as we can easily tell that they were manufactured by a machine for some sort of landscaping or building, right? And he would bring them to places like the Museum of Modern Art and display them as monuments, right, to New Jersey and its landscapes, right? And it was playful, this idea that why would you commemorate a random work site in Franklin, New Jersey, right, and treat it as if it was a monument or ruins a la the Colosseum in Rome, right, and devote as much attention to its materiality and the, you know, power of exhibiting and displaying it. But I also think and know from reading some of the interviews of Smithson and so forth that he was serious about this process as well. He understood precisely, right, that we can be, again, dazzled by the Colosseum in Rome and the grandiosity of the architect and its social meaning, but in some ways we maybe don't connect to it in the same way we do to vernacular landscapes that we understand and occupy, right? And I'm building all of this up because I want us to kind of transition now to thinking about why, and there's political reasons as well, and I'll come to those in just a moment, you know, it took so long to interpret the lives of everyday Americans, workers, in historic sites and homes, right? You know, for political reasons, we can, I think, use case studies from this country's history, from the US South, as another really telling example of the slowness, and in this case, as I mention maybe the more political and racialized reasoning behind the interpretation programs and plans. Again, the classic example being that when you went to antebellum plantation historic sites in the US South, the vision you received, right, the tours you were led on, again, the material culture that you encountered on display, was that of white slave owners and their families and the social worlds they occupied, rather than those who worked not only at the home itself, right, but beyond it in various occupations, right, for no pay, for no compensation, that made all that wealth possible, right? And as the historian Edward Linenthal has commented in a book, a classic from the field, Slavery and Public History, the tough stuff of American memory, and think about that title, right? How people kind of want to look away. They want to go to the plantation or to the fancy mansion, and again, bask in the opulence, maybe enjoy, again, worlds that seem distant and exotic, and in really troubling ways, imagining is not of coming in the back door, of emptying chamber pots, of working in the kitchen making someone else's meals, of looking at the big house from slave quarters, or of living every minute with the wrenching vulnerability of one's body or one's family. And again, I want to be very careful here, right? I'm not going to equate the abuses and the traumas that enslaved laborers suffered working at plantation sites, right? But the invisibility in terms of thinking about how domestic servants working for wages were similarly marginalized in respect to what visitors wanted to see, what did they want to engage with. I think that comparative point really stands. And I know as a public historian working in this field, it took effort of historians to challenge again what was getting presented and exhibited at plantations, to inspire those looking at homes with domestic servants for wages to adopt a similar approaches and say that we need to make similar efforts in our own interpretive plans and our own programming. And I'll just say, as a kind of an aside, there's some really wonderful examples now. This is on the Mississippi River, about an hour outside of New Orleans, the Whitney Plantation, where they flipped the script entirely, right? You can go to the Whitney Plantation and really learn very little about the family and, their wealth and their, tree and genealogy and so forth, because everything is focused on the enslaved laborers who worked there and the best of their ability, the stories that date all the way and trace all the way back to Africa. And so I think, again, a lot about this, all of the various applications and ways we might imagine reconstructing homes and residencies in order to tell different stories. This is from Los Angeles, a mural near what's now Dodger Stadium, the neighborhood of Chavez Ravine, which in the 1950s they essentially leveled and raised. And this is a story, as we were discussing before I began talking, that's applicable in many ways, I would imagine, to Trenton, right? They raised a whole neighborhood to build this baseball stadium, right? And so these people's homes, the places where they grew up, disappeared. And again, were these architecturally significant homes, right? No, these were, standard kind of working class homes in a Los Angeles neighborhood. But this really tells us a lot about how memory works, right? And how we remember the past. The homes didn't matter necessarily because of their architecture and what they allowed us to understand in respect to certain kind of practices and so forth. But they absolutely were meaningful for the ability of the residents there to connect with community histories, neighborhood histories, family and immigrant stories that were rooted in places, shops, restaurants, parks, and so forth that just simply no longer existed anymore. I'm working right now myself on a book on the history of Seabrook Farms. Seabrook Farms was a frozen foods agribusiness in South Jersey that in the 1940s and 1950s, by some estimates, produced 1/4 of all the frozen vegetables consumed in the United States. It was a huge growing and processing operation, and ran essentially a series of different company towns, some with pretty decent housing, others which were really just farm worker camps that were temporary structures designed to cater to seasonal workers who came in the thousands for a month when the final spinach crop needed to be harvested or beans were ripening on the vines. This was still before they were mechanical viners, and that all of this work is now automated, but I digress. And this is to me even more of a challenge, right? Because these were called Pemberton houses from Pemberton, New Jersey, where there were huge cranberry bogs where they harvested cranberries every fall. And so Pemberton had a housing company that offered 16 by 16 huts that could be assembled with 2 men on the cheap with no skills or anything but the basic kind of wrenches and other things you'd have around. And they argued house up to even 12 migrants in one of these 16 by 16 dwellings, right? Crowded all in. And again, it speaks to the fact that these large growers, right, certainly weren't necessarily thinking about their workers as humans who, deserved decent living conditions. But to me, this would be another example of a historic home we could even reconstruct, right? Recreate, create spaces that we can enter into and interpret in order to understand these histories of labor and migration. And I've been working with a group of individuals at Seabrook Farms to do some of these memory maps again, right? And unfortunately, you can't really do an activity like this with, say, a domestic servant from the early 19th century, early 20th century, unless you had some sort of detailed diary, right? Or some way to map onto the landscape of Trenton what a, daily itinerary would look like, right? What homes would she visit? Where might she go to, stop in to buy a newspaper but to catch up on gossip, right? What ethnic and communal associations might she have gone by? But obviously with more recent pasts and individuals who are still alive, you can ask them to kind of map spaces with these social and communal connections in mind. To get back to the focus of my talk and what I'm really trying to emphasize here, and I'll get into a second with my mandate and some of the research I've been thinking about and some questions I want to open up for maybe more of a group conversation. There's a great book by the historian Patricia West, Domesticating History, where she talks about the political origins of America's house museums. And just to kind of finalize this point and to kind of walk us through really this main takeaway I want us to think about, you're looking at a picture of Mount Vernon in Virginia. This is actually pre-restoration and pre-return to the famous tourist site that we know it is today. And this actually, the effort to preserve Mount Vernon as a historic site didn't begin to the 1850s, and it was picked up at the time by a group known as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, mainly white Virginian women who came from prominent, important families. I'm not going to say that it's a bad thing that Mount Vernon is preserved, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful that this historic site is there and that we can visit it and it exists, right? But as Patricia West and others have argued, and this is her title, right, there's a kind of political story to this. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association was worried about the forthcoming Civil War. They were actively searching for icons, figures that they felt could be used to facilitate national unity rather than division. Obviously, it took many years for Mount Vernon to interpret and to look at its own history of slavery. That wasn't the focal point. It was the idea that the Washingtons as a family could divide North and the South, and that by telling this story, you could elevate through their homes certain individuals to prominence in public education, right? Give school children a site where they can learn about the president and learn to, let's be perfectly frank, and maybe in recent years, Mount Vernon has begun to push back about this and complicate the story, right? But venerate the Washingtons as national heroes in the kind of manner that they also believe to make good Americans, right? And so this discourse will continue as well, right? How do you get immigrant children from Eastern and Southern Europe, right, to imbibe American values and learn the right way to act? Well, bring them to wealthy homes, right, and surround them with the trappings of the upper class life and the moral virtues, right, that the middle class home represents. And it's a way to kind of educate them and reform them as well. And again, you could imagine in these circumstances why you weren't finding lots of efforts to think about, well, if this family employed 5 domestic servants, what were their lives like, right? How did they fit into the home? What were they doing? What were their relationships with their employers like? One of the major projects I'm working on now, and it relates to everything I'm talking about, is this project Monuments to Migration and Labor. It's a Mellon Foundation Monuments project. And so in New Jersey, we're having these dialogues and conversations, and we're going to bring on board artists to use those public engagement sessions to vision, what monuments to workers and migrants would look like, and in ways that, confront people in the everyday. Because I talk about this in classes where we teach monuments and we think about monuments, because, there's so many Civil War statues, right, in northern New Jersey cities, and, New Jersey more generally, and you go there, right, and you see the Union soldier, and it's kind of so, again, ubiquitous and routine, it's really easy to ignore it, right? So we've kind of almost, we don't know who that soldier is, we don't tend to even care, right? And so, how do you build things in public spaces that confront and challenge people? And I like the idea, I know we've been talking about this a bit here, right? Some of the domestic workers, right? How could you kind of place them in the home in ways where they change people's kind of vision or sight, so to say, of what they're like thinking about and looking at. So let me talk a little bit about what I've been working out here with the Trent House. This is from the kind of summary of the project that Sam originally provided with me, with intimate portraits of domestic servants in the Gilded Age, Stokes households in Trent House, 1861 to 1929. And I'm not going to read this, it's on the screen. I think everybody, well, maybe I should read it. People can see it. It gives a kind of overview of, again, some of the questions that this historic site wanted to make more prominent, right, and foreground, again, as part of a larger effort to understand, not just again, as Sam put it to me and Denise in our conversations, right, to kind of not just figure out who worked here, right, although it's interesting, obviously, to accumulate that kind of demographic information and get a sense of where they're coming from, countries of origins, where age and so forth. But to get more generally, right, if you worked in this house, whether you were a live-in servant, right, so that's somebody who lives in the house, that will persist up until the early 20th century, where it really kind of disappears. And if I have a chance, I can talk about that. But, suffice it to say, it's not a practice that really persists today. I guess there's probably some super wealthy people who still have live-in servants, right? But we now live in an economy where you're much more likely to have, say, you pay a house cleaning service to come maybe once every 2 weeks, or, you hire childcare from any number of varieties. But there's a complicated market for that type of service, whereas really up until the early 20th century, domestic laborers were expected to live in the home of their employers. And be available around the clock, right? Because this is also an era when, you're tending to stoves and fires constantly. Just the lack of efficiency in doing certain tasks like washing clothes is really hard to get your head around, because most of us obviously are very familiar with washers and dryers and electronic utilities, right, that have made these tasks much more easier to perform. But we also want to think about, what is the relationship of the workforce in this house to this city? And so, there's a couple ways to do this. We're in the process of really thinking through some of this. I'll give you 2 examples, and then, we can open it up for more general conversation. Sam and Denise, I invite you to even share kind of your thoughts on some of this, since then we have a kind of record of it. I'll give you one example, and so you're looking at the census records now. This is James McCaffrey. This is 55 years old, so the 1870 census. We know from the census record he was born in Ireland. He identifies as a laborer. And so as I, got curious in James McCaffrey, again, James McCaffrey is an interesting individual. I don't want to deny James McCaffrey his, moment in the proverbial spotlight, so to say. But, at the same time, and this is true for all of us, so don't take offense, dead James McCaffrey, right? He's most interesting as representative of a kind of experience that allow insight in what it would have been like to be an immigrant laborer in this era. And to me, one of the kind of fascinating things that, again, we tend not to really focus on or appreciate today is that even if it does seem endangered at times, there is at least somewhat of a social safety net that will help us when we get old in terms of providing state or partially subsidized resources, right, that will guarantee we don't just die a pauper on the street, right? And that was a legitimate concern still in 1870 if you were an elderly individual. By the standards of the day, James McCaffrey at 55 was certainly getting up there. We know he appears in at least one more census, right, as I think a gardener more specifically, which, as I was talking about, with Sam and others, would have meant that he had maybe moved up an occupational rank to have a title like gardener rather than just general labor, meant that you at least had a specific craft or skill that you were being paid for and was a badge, right, in the kind of social hierarchy of domestic servants. And a cook for women would have occupied a similar position often. What did he do when he could no longer do that gardening work? When it became too arduous, it became too physical, right? If he was truly lucky and the Stokes were truly able to kind of make it happen, they might have just allowed him to live out the rest of his life in their home. I mean, those examples, to be honest, were few and far between, even though they're often kind of romanticized, right, as common. Most families didn't have the space or didn't want to have responsibility for an elderly or invalid individual, right? Maybe there were ethnic associations, so McCaffrey might have belonged to various social clubs that represented Irish immigrants in Trenton and Mercer County. They would have likely had forms of mutual aid to pay for members' funerals or maybe to provide care during the latter days of their lives. The kind of next stop, if none of that panned out, was, potentially the almshouse. And I know here in Trenton, right, the original almshouse was actually located where now junior high school number 1 is, right? Or junior high, I should say 1, I guess is no longer, it was burnt down, right? And so a place like that, that was not paid for by the state. The state might have given a little bit of funds. Typically it would have been paid for by private subscribers, maybe ironically, right, the Stokes themselves as prominent individuals in a family and community in Trenton would have likely, gave their bit to an almshouse, and in some ways maybe you could make the perverse argument they, provided a type of benefit to their employee after their retirement. But again, it wasn't easy and it was scary for elderly people. This is why immigrant communities tended to cluster, right? And tended to put a lot of stock in local institutions that could allow the community a type of collective security, knowing that, again, there wasn't really a state sort of option. Thinking about some of the women in the various households here in the different periods who would have worked as domestic servants, right? If you look at the census records, they tend to be young. They tend to be, between 17 and maybe 26 in general, right? I know Ireland, I think Poland, right? Immigrant streams that were coming to Trenton in large numbers. I think it's important to think about domestic service, even though we're looking at a period that only spans 70 years. There's some important leaps that it's really crucial to periodize. Until around 1880 or 1890, if you're a woman and you want to work for wages, you have very few options. You tend to end up in domestic labor. If you're in a textile city, there are some jobs in mills and so forth. But more than, I think it's around 55% of women working for wages across the US in 1870 are working as domestic laborers. It's far and away the most common occupation, just because many trades are simply barred to women outright, and there aren't opportunities. By around 1890, give or take, that will shift. By 1900, the number of women employed in domestic service as a percentage of wage earners is more like 30%, so it's dropped precipitously. And it inaugurates a cultural revolution or change in women's thinking, right? And it befuddles middle-class families and it befuddles reformers, because to them it makes no sense economically. They say, well, wages for women in a domestic setting tend to be about the same as, say, a woman who would be working at like a rowboat factory, for example, right? But women don't have to pay board as domestic servants, right? Because they're offered accommodations. This is still, prior to live-out servitude. So why would they not want to just continue working as domestic servants, right? Because the vast majority of women wage earners, if given the opportunity, choose to work in factories. The research is abundantly clear. If they have the opportunity, and if they don't have families who are saying you can't do that, right? That's the other restraint. That's the work they want to do. And this is where I'll connect some threads. I think this quote really speaks to it. By the end of 19th century, domestic service has garnered a reputation as a wage-earning occupation where you surrender your fundamental liberties and freedoms as an American, right? And it's cast as immigrant and black American labor, right? It becomes almost a matter of one's autonomy and citizenship as a worker if you can avoid it, right? And this quote from the superintendent of Ellis Island talks about it a little bit. The Holland Dutch girl who passes through Ellis Island Station with wooden shoes upon her feet kicks them off in less than a week and puts on plain leather ones instead. Within a month, she will wear high-heeled shoes with pointed toes, squeeze herself into a corset, an article she perhaps never saw before her arrival here, flourish a bustle and sport a parasol, and the chances that within a year some sensible fellow will have her married and settled in her in a cozy home, after which she will be looking for a greenhorn to do her housework, because she has become so Americanized that she is too delicate to do it herself, or because she is too busy with her piano lessons to afford the time, right? And again, this is fantasy, right? This is one individual's projection of rapid social mobility that white European immigrants allegedly could seize and use to advance their position. But truthful or not, right, the message is very clear. You want to avoid domestic service, right, because it's to perform degraded service for someone else, right? You want to be the wife, you want to be the mother, you want to be the manager giving the orders, not the ones receiving it. And domestic service is stigmatized. And to be truthfully honest, working in factories, you don't have someone looking over your shoulder all the time. You're not living under the constant surveillance and supervision of an employer. And there are freedoms and liberties. And there's an irony to that, again, because as I mentioned, right, the perception, the public perception at least, is that the factory is the dangerous workplace for the woman, right? That's where she's most at risk of inappropriate encounters and social mingling with, unmarried men and so forth, right? Whereas, servants talk among themselves and they know that the home is where the danger is, the hands that reach out, right, every time they walk by and so forth. And it was written about. My last point I'll lead, I'm curious, I've talked about this a little bit with Sam as well. The other parallel is just, what do we do with servants when they're not working in the home, right? Can you interpret their lives in a sense beyond the space of their workplace? When I talk to my students about this, I think it's really fascinating reminding them that because of the increased participation of women in the workforce, changing commercial cultures, by the 1900s, if you were a servant in a household where at least you had some ability to maybe have 2 days off, every couple weeks, or get certain days off, right? You could go to places like Coney Island, Atlantic City, other spots on the Jersey Shore, and find a commercial culture that actually catered to you, that appealed to you. There's this great 1906 publication by the Independent magazine, a left-leaning journal of the time, where they did interviews with ordinary and everyday Americans. And this is with Agnes, a German servant from 1906, where she's talking about how I like New York. I have a great many friends in New York, and I enjoy my outings with them. We go to South Beach or North Beach or Glen Island or Rockaway or Coney Island. If we go on a boat, we dance all the way there and all the way back, and we dance nearly all the time we are there. I like Coney Island best of all. It is a wonderful and beautiful place. I took a German friend, a girl who had just come out, down there last week, and when we had been on the razzle-dazzle, the chute, and the loop-de-loop, and down at the coal mine and all over the Bowery, and these are all the different rides and entertainments at Coney Island, and up in the tower and everywhere else, I asked her how she liked it. She said, it is just like what I see when I dream of heaven. Agnes generally liked her employers, but she wished she could teach them a thing or two about having fun. Yet I have heard some of the high people with whom I have been living say that Coney Island is not Tony. The trouble is that these high people don't know how to dance. I have to laugh when I see them at their balls and parties. If only I could get on the floor and show them how they would be astonished, right? And I want to just leave there, because I think, right, the more that you look into, I should say, the lives of the domestic laborers who worked in this home, right, the more you contemplate what their lives would have been like, I think it's records we tend to have to write them off as people who faced lots of exploitation and drudgery and, overall didn't really have a great life. And, I would be the last to deny that they faced hard work and, certainly various forms of exploitation. Did they probably encounter mean employers with unreasonable demands and difficult personalities to manage? Absolutely, right? But they also, had agency. They also found ways to enjoy themselves. They did have immigrant communities in the city which they belonged to. They would have gossiped behind their employers' back and found other ways to express solidarity. And so, hopefully some of that life will come out in interpretations and exhibitions as well. Thank you for having me this afternoon.